Good morning, and welcome to the hearing of January 10th of the Santa Barbara Planning Commission. If you'd join me for the Pledge of Allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. And Mr. Villalobos, if you'll make the TV announcement and call the roll.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Planning Commission hearings are televised live on County and Santa Barbara Television, CSB TV, Channel 20 at 9 a.m. in the South Coast, Lompoc, San Ynez Valley, Santa Maria, and Orchid areas. Rebroadcasts of Planning Commission hearings are on Fridays at 5 p.m. on CSB TV, Channel 20. Today's hearing will also be streamed live on CSB TV's website, as well as the county's YouTube channel. Will be available for download in a day or two. Now for the roll call. Commissioner Brown. Here. Commissioner Farini.
Here.
Chair Blau.
Here.
And for the record, Commissioner Cooney is absent today.
Great, thank you. And now, Commissioner Brown, I think it's time for the election of the chair and vice chair.
It would be my greatest pleasure to recommend for election our vice chair, Commissioner Dan Blau, to be chair.
Thank
Better second that.
You better.
Okay.
Great, thank you. So all those in favor by saying aye?
Aye.
Thank you. No?
And then I think we'll wait until we have another planning commissioner appointed by the board to elect.
Yeah, we'll do the vice chair next meeting. We don't need one today. Great. So the next order of business is the appointment of the commission secretary and recording secretary. And for the commission secretary, I'm going to nominate Jeff Wilson.
I'll heartily endorse that.
So all those in favor say, signify by saying aye?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you. And for the appointment of the recording secretary, I will re-nominate David Villalobos.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
So be it. So who's going to be doing the projection report this morning then? Mr. Wilson.
Chair Blau, congratulations on being the chair, and then thank you for the appointment as Planning Commission Secretary. For the agenda status report, there are 2 items on the consent agenda, and there are 3 items on the standard agenda, the cannabis and the cultural resources in Lompoc Stone. I believe there is a request to continue that we can take up later for the Lompoc Stone item when that comes up for regular agenda. And then, do you want me to move forward on the projection report?
Please. Mm-hmm.
In the projection report, we have on the next meeting is January 17th, which has been canceled, and then following that will be January 31st. There's the ordinance to rescind the Article 10, the Abitrac map was continued to that hearing date, as well as there is an appeal on that date. And then accessory dwelling units has been scheduled for that day as well on January 31st. There are no items scheduled at this time for February 7th and the 14th. The 14th, it is noted that Commissioner Brown will be absent that day. And we may want to address February 7th on the next hearing, just depending on what happens today to keep that open for if any items get continued. And then the meeting after that would be February 28th, which there are long-range planning is bringing the work program for your review and consideration, and then there are 2 appeals on that. There's 1 appeal for the North Fork reservoirs, and then a standard application for a ready-mix batch plant. And then March 7th, there's another appeal, and then going out a ways is March 28th, the HOV project. General plan amendment is scheduled for that day.
Great. Any questions from commissioners? Not seeing any.
Mr. Chair, if I can just make a couple of comments about the agenda today and potential hearing dates into the future. So as I know all of your commissioners are aware, we had a pretty horrific event in the South Coast yesterday. The Highway 101 is closed people can't get out of Montecito or Carpinteria, and so, including Commissioner Cooney. So that's why he isn't here today. We have received several requests to continue the cannabis hearing, and I did have a chance to talk to Commissioner Cooney this morning and confirm his availability for a hearing on January 24th. So that's not a hearing date on your projection report at this point in time, but it would be a time that we could have the commission take final action recommendations to the Board of Supervisors. And I think we, although it's not ideal and will be a little bit difficult, we can still get to the Board of Supervisors at their projected February 6th hearing. So, you know, in recognition of everything that's gone on and the effects it's had on people who are very interested in this project, I would recommend that we go ahead and set a special hearing date of January 24th. We'll hopefully have our new commissioner on board by then as well, which would be, you know, obviously an advantage. Commissioner Cooney will be here, and the people who in the South County that are interested in participating would be hopefully available by then as well. But you may want to get your staff, you know, get the staff presentation today and take public testimony. There are a number of people here. That's really up to the commission, but I just wanted to address that kind of up front as well. Yeah. And make sure commissioners are available. Yeah.
Okay, well, I planned on polling my other two commissioners that are here today as to whether or not we would want a staff report today or if we just want to postpone the staff report until the 24th. The reason being is that Commissioner Cooney and our new commissioner can both watch the tape and see the staff report, but I'm probably more inclined to let them hear the staff report, be able to ask questions, because I'm also kind of thinking that in this particular case, I'm going to want to interrupt the staff during the report to ask questions and make comments, because there are so many items that's so complex. What I didn't want to do was to have them do the entire staff report and then go back and ask questions. I think it's more difficult. So I think we will suspend the staff report today, let you make it again on the 24th, as long as you guys concur. And that way we can interject questions and comments during the staff report as each item comes forward. So I see both lights are lit, so I'll ask you both to address that issue.
Okay.
Mr. Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, I'd just like to follow on from Ms. Black's comments and send my deepest sympathy to all Montecito residents. Although I live in Goleta, I watched TV yesterday, and it was really horrifying and horrible for all those people who live there, who live on that particular portion of our south coast. So I'm very grateful that we're able to change the hearing date. I think it will be helpful for us all, for the residents. We've received a lot of paperwork in the last couple days, and it's difficult to read all the public comment when you get over 300 pages for the last day when you're trying to do your own studying. So I would support that, and I do appreciate being able to support the continuance.
Mr. Farini.
Yeah, just checking in. We will hear public comment today.
Yes, we will. We'll hear public comment.
And no staff report, and then we'll come back on the 24th as Ms. Black suggested. We'll follow that whole path.
Right. And do you need a motion for that? We're going to continue it, but do we need to do anything to set the 24th, or just do it when we make the motion to continue?
Mr. Chair, you can set that now, or you can set it when you make a motion to continue. It's really up to you. But so we don't forget, you might want to just do it now.
So I'll entertain a motion to have a special hearing the 24th.
Yeah. So moved.
I'll make that motion.
Great.
Ms. Black will be in Santa Barbara here.
Santa Barbara, if that's okay with the commission.
That's fine.
Okay.
So all those in favor, aye?
Aye.
Aye. Oh, so carried. Okay. Next on our agenda is public comment for items not on today's agenda. Do we have any subs for that, Ms. Brown? Mr. Brown? Not seeing anybody rise. I'll assume that we don't. So I'm looking at their screen and there's no one there, so I don't think. Great. Okay, next item to do is we have 2 sets of minutes to approve. The first is for the hearing of December 6th.
I'll make a motion to approve.
Hang on a sec.
Okay,
You're on the 6th.
we're on the 6th.
Okay, yeah, that one's fine.
All right, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Carried.
And
That
then
was-
on the 13th,
Yep.
just a typo. It says commissioners absent, none. And we know that Commissioner St. John was absent.
Yeah.
And it shows up in the voting record as her absent. So we just need to make that slight change, and then I'm ready to approve those.
So that was a motion?
Yes.
Those in favor say aye. Aye. Okay. All right. Now we have Director's Report and Board of Supervisors hearing summary. And I see Dr. Russell's here.
Good morning, Chair Blau. Congratulations on becoming chair, commissioners. I really don't have much to report today. There was a hearing yesterday, but as you may be aware, they decided not to really have anything other than the admin agenda, so I don't really have too much to report on, except that there will be a Board of Supervisors hearing all day Friday in the Planning Commission room beginning at 8 a.m., where they will take up the items that they did not hear on yesterday's agenda, including the cannabis taxation issue. So people in the audience may be interested in hearing that if they were not already aware. But that's all I really have today.
Great, thank you. Any questions? Not, Commissioner Freeney, your light's still on? All right. Just checking. Great. Okay, moving to consent item agendas. Mr. Villalobos, if you read item number 1 into the record.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The following is a hearing on the request of David Swink of Rural Planning Services, agent for Betaravia Properties, to consider case number 17 TEX24, application filed on October 19, 2017, for a 1-year time extension to December 14, 2018, for case numbers 15 CUP11 and 16 CUP3, and to accept the previously adopted mitigated negative declaration, case number 16 NGD5, as adequate environmental review.
Great. Any questions from commissioners or any reason to pull this item from the consent agenda? Not seeing any. Mr. Villalobos, if you'll call the roll. Sorry, we need to make a motion to approve that. And that is?
Make a motion to approve consent item 1.
Great. Now, if you would read or take the roll call, please.
Commissioner Brown. Aye. Commissioner Farini.
Aye.
Chair Blau.
Aye.
Motion passes 3-0.
If you read item number 2 on the consent agenda.
The following is a hearing on Kim Link of Urban Planning Concepts, agent for Anthony Wells of Oak Hills Partners, LLC, to consider case number 17 TEX22, application filed on October 3rd, 2017, for a 1-year time extension to November 18, 2018, for case number 07 DVP16, and to accept the previously adopted mitigated negative declaration 08 NGD11 as adequate environmental review pursuant to section 15162 of the state guidelines for implementation of the California Environmental Quality Act.
Great, thank you.
I'll make a motion to approve.
Okay.
Second.
And before I ask for the roll call, I do see Mr. Wells in the audience, and Mr. Tully was in the audience. Was there any? Did you wish to make any comment before we vote on this issue? Not seeing anybody rise. Anybody else in the audience make comment? Not seeing any. Go ahead and call the roll, Mr. Villalobos.
Commissioner Brown.
Aye.
Commissioner Farini.
Aye.
Chair Blau.
Aye.
Motion passes 3-0.
Great. Okay, and now we come to the big gorilla in the audience. If you read our first standard agenda item, Mr. Villalobos.
Mr. Chair, since we're going to be taking public comment on the cannabis item, and I know there are people in Santa Barbara who want to testify about the continuance on Lompoc Stone, can we
Do Lompoc
go
Stone
to
first?
Lompoc Stone and just make a decision as to whether or not it will be continued, and then we can go back to cannabis?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
It's if you'll read Lompoc Stone item to the agenda first, Mr. Villalobos.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. The following is a hearing on the request of Sis Goldstein, agent for the applicant, Lompoc Stone, to consider case number 16 DET4 and 10 RVP 48 applications filed on November 8, 2016 and June 9, 2010, and to adopt the mitigated negative declaration, case number 12 NGD 22, pursuant to the state guidelines for implementation of the California Environmental Quality Act.
So I assume we're suspending the staff report, but do we need to go to Mr. Goldstein to see if he wishes to make comment in Santa Barbara?
Mr. Chair, I think Mr. Chitillo is in Santa Barbara, is my understanding, and I don't know if Mr. Goldstein is here.
Okay, Mr. Chitillo, you have the floor.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the Commission. First, I think, we fully support the continuance. I think the conditions here in the South Coast make it such that it's appropriate that the Commission do not consider this item at this point. Our hearts and thoughts are with Commissioner Cooney and all the residents and people in Montecito and all the first responders that are working on trying to identify and rescue the people that are there. That's really the focus of our community right now. So for that reason, we fully support the continuance and look forward to bringing in this matter and discussing it completely with your commission at the appropriate time in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments from anybody?
There are some representatives from Lompoc Stone here in the audience. I don't know if you want to hear from them at all.
If you want to come forward, please.
Thank you, Chair and Commissioners. We wanted to thank you for your time, and our thoughts go out to everybody in Santa Barbara County also. And we appreciate your consideration of continuing this, so we have a chance to review all the documents and prepare a correct response to everything that's been submitted. So thank you.
Great, thank you. Commissioner Farini, this is a 4th District item.
So I'll move for a continuance.
Do we have a date in mind for that, Ms. Black, or
Mr. Wilson.
it's going to be a little hard for me to, Mr. Wilson. Mr. Wilson, yes. Help us out here.
Chair Blau and Commissioners, looking at February 14th was a potential date, but I think I'd recommend moving it to March 7th. Or the next day would be February 28th would be another possible date. So if the applicant, I haven't got any direction from the applicant.
If the applicant could come back to the microphone and tell us where we could do one of the 2 dates. I think they're going to ask you to pick one.
So the March 7th date would be here, back in Santa Maria? That'd be fine with us. Oh, it's not?
So the next date in Santa Maria would be February 28th.
February 28th. If that date is better for you guys than the 14th, then that'll work for us. February 28th would be fine.
February 28th is.
February 28th.
All right.
We'll continue to there. Second.
I'll second that.
Great.
Okay. Thank you, Commissioners. Thank you, Chair.
Mr. Villalobos, if you'll read the roll.
Commissioner Brown?
Aye.
Commissioner Farini?
Aye.
Chair Blau?
Aye.
Motion passes 3-0.
Okay, great. All right. Now we're back to the cannabis hearing. Mr. Villalobos, if you'll read that to the record.
The following is a hearing on the request of the Planning and Development Department that the Planning Commission recommend that the Board of Supervisors adopt ordinance case number 17 ORD 4 and 10, and to recommend that the Board certify the Cannabis Land Use Ordinance and Licensing Program Final Programmatic Environmental Impact Report, case number 17 ER3, and the associated revision letter RV01 pursuant to state CEQA guidelines.
Thank you. Before I ask for public comment, I'm just going to ask if there are any questions that the Commission wants to ask the staff now before we start. Not seeing any. Our first speaker will be Bruce Wilkins.
Thank you for your time this morning, and my name is Bruce Watkins again. So in reviewing the recommendation for changes prior to this, as well as the cannabis land use ordinances handed out, I was looking at this new 35.42.075 section on cannabis regulations, which is good. I just wanted to comment on item 3. That's found on page 36 of Exhibit C, or Attachment C, Exhibit 1 of the Cannabis Land Use Ordinances, and it's the permit requirements for commercial cannabis activities. And in the notes down below, in bullet point 3 of the notes, there's a section that deals with the use of roadways located within an EDRN as the sole means of access. And in searching through the county's land use ordinances and the coastal zone land use ordinances, I just want to comment that this seems a bit arbitrary. There's no language elsewhere in the county codes that uses a condition like this. It's not a recommendation or even addressed by the EIR documents. It appears, something like this appears nowhere in the state of California cannabis laws. And in my experience working in this industry in 11 states, I'm not familiar with a precedence for it anywhere. So it doesn't seem well supported by anything that's been presented before. And I would just question whether or not there's a basis for it to being in there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next speaker will be Amy Stanfield.
Good morning, Commissioners. Thank you. I'm an attorney with Brownstein, Hyatt, Farber & Schreck in Santa Barbara, and I represent the Cates School. As you know, they could not be here today, so thank you for continuing the meeting to the 24th. They will be there and have public comment. First, I would like to thank the county for taking a very hard look at this issue and augmenting the odor abatement plan regulations. However, we still have major concerns with the ordinance as written. First, we believe it favors the interests of the cannabis industry over local residents. Second, it does not place a cap on the number of permits for commercial cannabis operations that can be issued. Third, it allows outdoor cultivation and cannabis manufacturing in Ag 1 zones. And fourth, the documents do not sufficiently analyze impacts on public safety, housing, and waste disposal. So in response, we've identified a few recommendations that we believe would result in a more fair and balanced ordinance. And with your permission, I would like to pass them out after I finish going through each of them. So first, we believe that it's necessary to put a cap and phasing on the number of cannabis cultivation operations. This was already, as you know, analyzed in the EIR. So we believe that there should be a cap. The cap should be limited to 962 permits, and there should be a regional cap in specific regions. We also believe it makes sense to phase out these permits annually. And the reason being is because this will allow the county really to see what the impacts are and to see if the mitigation is actually working. So we're concerned that by issuing an unlimited number of permits, potentially in the first or second year, it's going to be very difficult for the county to move back on its position. So we believe that a slow phasing is really necessary to identify what is happening and what the impacts are in our county. Second, we believe there should be an anti-concentration regulation. And what this would mean is that not only would there be a buffer between, for example, two separate, for example, a sensitive receptor, but there would also be a buffer between two different cannabis operations. And there's also some great precedent for this in the county's existing code related to adult entertainment businesses. So I've provided that for you so you can take a look at that. So what we're proposing is that there would be a 500-foot buffer between two separate cannabis activities or businesses. Our third recommendation is that Ag 1 would not be allowed to include outdoor cultivation. As you know, this was already analyzed in Alternative 3, and we believe that this would still meet most of the project objectives, but also reduce significant impacts. Lastly, we're unclear about what the permitting process is going to entail, so we are recommending that there's public notification of all impacted neighbors. And so not just limited to, for example, 300 to 500 feet, but based on and rationally related to the distance that odor travels. So at this point, we're recommending that before issuance of a new cannabis permit, the neighbors within 1,000 feet shall be notified and provided an opportunity for public comment. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we'll hear from Patricia Hansen.
Good morning. Thank you for allowing me to speak. My sympathies go out to the residents affected by this devastating flood in the areas of the Thomas Fire. I live in the area of the Alamo Fire, and we had our own stuff to deal with. I'm a longtime resident of Tepiscate Canyon, and I am totally opposed to the cannabis activity in my neighborhood. It is my big concern that the 30-odd growers in the canyon will continue to operate illegally. As far as I know, none have been investigated by the local sheriff department or the Santa Barbara County planning representatives. The growers are in violation of local permit regulations and continue to expand their grow sites. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we're going to go to Santa Barbara for James List.
Good morning. My name is James Lisi. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. I am a resident of the county area, Rancho del Ciervo, and our neighborhood butts up on Ag 2 land. So our major concern is the urbanization of our residents and the impacts on safety and the risks to teenagers and the influence of organized crime and potential theft in the area. So we would like a buffer, probably larger than anybody would even think about, but maybe 5 miles around a high school. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we'll go to Santa Barbara, Matt Allen.
Good morning. Matt Allen here on behalf of Central Coast Agriculture. I'm a land use attorney from Los Olivos. Nice to see you all this morning. I wanted to talk to you briefly about the possibility of removing the requirement for a CUP for volatile manufacturing as long as the volatile manufacturing facility size was small enough so that the impacts weren't too large. This would be similar to the winery ordinance, where if the facility is less than 20,000 square feet, it could be done with a land use permit. The impacts for volatile manufacturing versus non-volatile manufacturing, as far as traffic, cars, noise, impacts on the neighbors, are really dramatically similar. I don't see a reason why a CUP would be required there. The state requires very significant standard operating procedures with regard to volatile manufacturing, so that those issues, as far as the impacts of the chemicals, are really protected underneath the state requirements. And when you talk about a very small volatile manufacturing facility, the cost of a CUP, which can be dramatic, my own experience, even amending a winery CUP for a new storage facility was upwards of $150,000 in costs and processing fees. Those costs are just too high to get a small facility through, and they're going to wind up going somewhere else. So if we really are serious about wanting to embrace this industry, about wanting to create tax revenue for the county, requiring a CUP for a small volatile manufacturing, something less than 20,000 square feet, seems excessive. And I think we should consider a 2-track system in that area. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I'll go to Denise Fellows.
Good morning. I'm a resident of Rancho del Ciervo, and we border the orchards. Literally, they are out our back doors. Our children, we have over 176 homes, play in that area, and I am very concerned about the quality of life and the health and welfare of our children and our communities. We are not the only foothill neighborhood bordering Ag Land 2 property. So I am adamantly opposed to this current ordinance. I think it is far too close to our neighborhoods. It will affect our quality of life and property values, as well as the health and welfare of our community. Not only will it affect those things, the quality of life will be much diminished by the smell that comes from cannabis growth. The smell is overwhelming. Our neighbors in Carpinteria are complaining consistently, and crime has come into the area. We are a family neighborhood. We are not a neighborhood where cannabis growth should happen. My other concern is that currently we have orchards in our backyard between us and the Los Padres Forest. Those orchards consist of avocados, lemons, and during the Gap Fire, they were a huge break for the homes in our area. If we put cannabis in, it is going to it is going to burn like crazy, and it will offer no protection to the homes in our foothill areas along that stretch of land that is the you put between the homes and the Los Padres Forests. I really think that this ordinance has not had enough public information. There have been too many. There have not been enough notices. Not many of my neighbors get the news press, and that's my understanding where most of this notification has gone out. And I really believe that there should be more opportunity for public comment. Really, I'm greatly concerned, too, that the county has not considered the amount of services that will be required to permit and audit all of these sites, and really how is the tax that it is going to supposedly bring that back to the county cover all of the cost of public safety that will be necessary, and as well as the county staff time that will be necessary to follow each of these different grows. So I am imploring you to please delay this and allow the public to have more comment and allow the public to know truly what is going on with this ordinance. It is a very long staff report to read. The addendums are unbelievably long, and really it has not been covered well enough in our local counties for the average Joe to understand what is happening currently at this level. Please consider your public and not just the cannabis growers. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we'll go to Barbara Cluse, and that's my last speaker for Santa Barbara. Is anybody else down there that wishes to speak? Please stand up after Barbara's done. Thank
you. Thank you. My name's Barbara Close, and I was surprised and greatly disheartened to read the project objectives in the EIR. The very first objective states that the county develop a very robust cannabis industry that ensures availability to meet local demands. The Planning Commission never adopted this objective, the supervisors never voted on going forward with this objective, and the public had no opportunity to comment and give input on this objective. It appears that the EIR process was completely subverted by the ad hoc committee that drafted this objective with mainly input from the cannabis industry and their legal counsel. The staff continues to marginalize and dismiss the citizens of the county and has shown little regard for protecting our neighborhoods or community character. That becomes more clear when any thought about the quality of life, people's health, our neighborhood crime, etc., are the last three considerations in the project objectives, numbers 8, 9, and 10. The disrespect for the welfare of the larger community is ignored in the ordinance as it is written, and the community is just a token mention, and the proliferation of the industry seems to be the main objective. To correct this and to consider the residents of the county who will permanently live with the effects of these ordinances, I suggest the following. Increase the buffer from 600 to 1,200 feet, which is a middle ground between what the state requires and what the Montecito Planning Commission has recommended. Please add buffers on smaller Ag 1 and Ag 2 parcels, which are needed to protect residents and children that live adjacent to these Ag parcels. Eliminate all mixed-use zone districts which have residential components from any cannabis activities until the county has had time to see the effect of the cannabis ordinance on the community. I ask that you would please take a phased approach to starting this conservatively. Please limit the number of licenses and use the environmentally superior alternative. Exclude consumption on site at dispensaries, which was never discussed or considered other than appearing in several sentences in the EIR. If consumption is allowed, we will be consenting to people driving stoned with no way to adequately measure how much pot somebody has consumed. Please propose a limit of how much acreage and the number of businesses that can operate in the county as a startup for the industry. This will give us time to see how the industry impacts our community character. One data point that is rarely discussed is that almost 90% of the cannabis grown in California is shipped illegally out of state. Who knows how much cannabis our county needs to meet the local demand, which was in the EIR? How will this get determined and decided? It is likely that we are already meeting the local demand without adding even one more acre of cannabis to our county. Another issue that goes largely unmentioned is the registry that is being used as the gold standard for making decisions about how much of the industry to allow in our communities. This registry has never been vetted or verified, which means that we are using unsubstantiated and flawed data as our baseline. And now we find that 2 supervisors want an unlimited number of businesses to operate with no cap. I request that you consider a phase-in plan which was adopted by the County of Los Angeles this month. I believe this to be a well-thought-out plan that respects and upholds the community values while allowing cannabis businesses to begin operating, and I have sent a copy of this via email to all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Not seeing anybody else stand in Santa Barbara, I'll come back to Santa Maria for Hunter Jameson.
Chairman Blau and Commissioners, my name is Hunter Jameson, and I am a resident of Santa Maria. I have been following the progress of the marijuana regulations since, nearly the beginning of last year, and I just have to say, although I wasn't planning to, Ms. Close's remarks are absolutely correct. There's never any doubt from observing the actions of the supervisors, and maybe I should be making these comments to them, although I feel it's virtually useless. They had already decided. Their ad hoc committee of the two supervisors made it very plain that they were going to embrace and adopt the marijuana industry before the whole procedures began. It's basically the idea that they even have an open mind about not letting the industry grow in our area or letting it not operate is farcical. It is just obvious from the outset that their mind was made up to permit the industry. I don't think that's ultimately within your purview, so I will make comments about the EIR. That's how I'll start my comments today, and so we'll take it from there. First, requiring a major conditional use permit for marijuana cultivation in existing developed residential neighborhoods with the roadway provision is an excellent improvement. I have never lived in Tepesca Canyon, but I believe the residents there and in similar locales deserve at least the protection of a CUP. Second, requiring lots for outdoor cultivation in the Ag 1 zone to be at least 20 acres is a step in the right direction, but preventing all outdoor cultivation in Ag 1 zones is something that should be considered. Next, because marijuana businesses are not allowed in strictly residential zones, please do not permit any in mixed-use zones, including Los Alamos and Orcutt. Next, it is indeed wise to require marijuana businesses to have odor abatement plans. I would just urge that these plans have enough teeth to eliminate noxious odors for residents and for other uses that are affected. And I think especially of residents in the Carpinteria area and Carpinteria High School and the Cate School. Along with adults, our future leaders and their teachers need a healthful environment. To enhance protection further for our young people, I urge you to request the Board of Supervisors to increase the buffer area for schools, daycare centers, and youth centers to 1,000 feet for marijuana businesses instead of 600 feet. Please recommend a buffer zone of 1,000 feet. Thank you.
Thank you. And next speaker will be Renee O'Neill.
Good morning, Commissioners. I also want to give my heartfelt thoughts and prayers to the folks down in South County who are having such deluging issues with this last storm. I want to also commend the speakers regarding the Cate School, Barbara, you were excellent. Thank you, Hunter Jameson. We ditto everything you said in regard to this. I, too, want to thank the commissioners for creating the CUP, the conditional use permit. It has some very strong language and teeth, and in my interpretation of that CUP, none of the growers in Tepiscay would be allowed to get a permit based on that. If I'm wrong, I'd like someone to let me know that I'm not interpreting that correctly. I still feel that growers that are receiving permits should be required to give a hefty bond to ahead of time in order to have the funds available for all the issues that were raised by one of our speakers regarding permits and the whole process and enforcement. I'd also like to know what new steps and laws will the county create to enforce these new regulations. I suggested in my letter to you creating an exceptional inspection regulation for cannabis operators, ERCO, so that authorities will be able to inspect grow sites without prior notice. Too many times these growers have said, oh, sure, you can come on up here, and I watch all the illegal, unpermitted things going through my driveway, and I have photographs of the pot going out, and the generators going out, and the materials going out, and the hoop houses going out, and as soon as you're gone, it all comes back in. So, unless and until you have long overdue aggressive law enforcement to control this, how will you prevent the exploitation, continued exploitation of our fragile and vulnerable communities, all who are represented and most who are represented at this meeting today? And we include Sabata Canyon, Carpinteria, Cielo community, all of these different communities. We need enforcement and protection now, not a year from now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now I'll go to Lil Clary.
Residents of Tepiscay Canyon definitely support the requirement for a conditional use permit. We are very pleased also to see the statement in the document recommending that any parcel accessed through the EDRN also be required to submit to the CUP processes. Unfortunately, I do not believe the illegal growers on Tepiscay Canyon will be requesting CUPs for their parcels. The bulk of the illegal grows in Tepiscay were established while the countywide moratorium has been in effect. This does not bode well for future compliance. Further, the CUP requirements, as Renee noted, are stringent enough that it is likely they will not be able to obtain permits. They will just continue their operations and thumb their noses at residents and county officials. How then should the county deal with illegal growers? Currently, the reactive process based on permitting is totally ineffective. Canyon residents who have inquired about filing complaints have been told that they need to prove that the plants in these hoop houses are cannabis. Apparently, the odor of the plants, the constant traffic, and the known ownership by individuals who have identified themselves to county officials and appointed officials as cannabis growers are not sufficient reasons to substantiate a complaint. Here's what I believe the county needs in order to put the illegal growers out of business and to restore our unique environment. Adopt the language from the Oaks Ordinance. It allows immediate access to sites. It establishes fines of $25,000 a day. It gives the county the right to prosecute as a misdemeanor. I would add, require enforcement by sworn law officers and use an asset forfeiture process to punish these criminals. Report illegal growers to the state to prevent them from operating in other venues. Recently, Tepiscay Canyon was referred to as junk land by an agent of the Cannabis Investment Group who is present today at this meeting. We are not junk land. Tepiscay is a very special region with a unique physical environment whose residents are deeply committed to ensuring that cannabis does not take over our homes. We refuse to be collateral damage to the greedy illegal operators. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker will be Bud Sprague.
Good morning. My name is Bud Sprague. I also come from Rancho del Ciervo in the unincorporated area down between Goleta and Santa Barbara. And I just have to say I've been sitting here for most of this meeting so far, and I haven't heard a word yet that I didn't agree with. It just seems that there are so many holes here that it's unbelievable. I have spent very little time. I first heard about this New Year's Eve, as a matter of fact. And I've spent very little time looking at it. But what I've seen, I just have some problems that I want to discuss with you. Most of them have already been discussed, but I want to emphasize them. The maps that were included with all of the schools and daycare centers with buffer zones around them, those kids go home. They spend the bulk of their time in the residences. The residences aren't protected at all. In our neighborhood, you could go to back fences and spit on Ag 2 land. I mean, it's that close. So we just need large buffers. That is pure and simple. It's been said enough here today, but I think it needs to keep being emphasized, more buffers. The analysis, the fiscal analysis, and I know some people I think are really pushing this because of the money involved. And what the fiscal analysis concludes is that a tax on cannabis cultivation in Santa Barbara County could conceivably generate anywhere between roughly $4 million and $64 million. That's quite a spread. And it's not the most definitive statement I've ever heard. Could conceivably generate anywhere between roughly $4 and $64 million. At what cost? In enforcement and in administration and in environmental impacts. The cost may easily exceed the revenues. HDL, who did the study, also concludes that the county's cannabis cultivation industry is, and I quote, more likely to see contraction in coming years rather than expansion. I assume this is the result of competitive forces and lower prices. Why are we so anxious to promote a business that will probably be expanding rather than be contracting rather than expanding? My final point is I don't understand why Alternative 3 on Attachment A, page 13, is not seriously considered. This would allow the county to issue half of the number of licenses being asked for, 962 instead of 1,924. It seems this would be more than enough to provide cannabis for our county. Are we trying to build a business to sell statewide and other states and maybe worldwide? If so, if that's what we're really doing, why? Please take a fresh look at least those two issues. The need for buffers in neighborhoods like ours. It's hundreds of homes involved. It's all of the homes that are north of Cathedral Oaks in the Santa Barbara unincorporated area that I'm thinking of when I talk about this. And take a look at Alternative 3 on Attachment A. That should be seriously considered. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next speaker, a great pleasure to introduce this gentleman, John Park. He's going to be our new 3rd District Planning Commissioner. John?
Thank you for the introduction. 3 quick points. Yes, that is true. I am Supervisor Hartman's appointee for the 3rd District Planning Commission. Just with the various noticing requirements, I'm not able to sit up there with you today, but I wanted to attend this hearing to hear all of the public comment, so I wanted to assure all the people that have spoken today, have submitted letters, that the third district is listening, even though we're not up there in a chair. And I really appreciate people for coming today and for speaking out. Second, I wanted to express my appreciation to staff for the very thorough staff report, which I look forward to now having the time to digest. And finally, I want to thank those of you on the commission today for continuing the item to the 24th, because there I think you will have a full commission. And I think this is such an important matter, it merits consideration by the full Planning Commission. So thank you.
Thank you. Welcome aboard when you get here. That's my last speaker. Any other speakers that I'm missing? Great. Then I will close the public hearing, come back to the staff for comment on the public comment, and then I'll go to commissioner questions. Ms. Jessica, please.
Chair Blau, we have no comments at this point in time. Thank you.
Okay. Now Commissioner Brown has some comments and questions. I'll let her start.
Well, thank you, Commissioner Blau. To facilitate our discussion at our next hearing, I would request of staff that we see maps, if you have this information, of the number of growers by size of ag, whether ag 1, ag 2, and sort of by district. You may not know exactly where they are, but because the ag issue has been discussed quite extensively, I think it would be helpful for us to understand throughout, I think it's the 3rd district, 2nd and 1st, the size of the parcels, what kind of cannabis is on these parcels. If you know that, you may not know that. So we can sort of understand that issue because of what staff is recommending and what the public is requesting as well. So that would be helpful. Also, you know, driving up here this morning, I saw some new, I'm not sure if they were hoop houses or greenhouses. There may not be much distinction between either of them, but I know regulations are slightly different for each kind. So I'm wondering if there's, you can provide us some further information on sort of the distinction between the two. And I know there are, as I said, different regulations for each, but just because I'm not aware of them. And also in the EIR, there is information about volatile manufacturing, but but I would appreciate your being prepared to discuss it in some detail such that the public could understand the issues with it and how it really is different than non-volatile. I mean, what the issues are with the materials being used. So those would be my comments, just to help prepare for our next meeting.
Great. Commissioner Farini.
Yeah, and just to staff for the next meeting to kind of help things along, it was suggested by the Cielo neighborhood there about this alternative 3 that's in the EIR and how that would work. And I did review it a couple days ago. It does make sense to me, and I would just like to flesh that out a little bit more and see. I've heard that legally we couldn't adopt it because the EIR mission statement, but anyway, I'd like to seriously look at that and see if we could help move that in. And so that's part of that's limiting licenses. The other thing I heard today that I like is phasing licenses and use. And I think Cecilia was discussing looking at these areas, but something we don't really know is the initial people that signed up, that number, are they still active? I don't know if we have time to look at that. Are they for real? Are these numbers over-exaggerated? So just some way to align those, whether it's an Excel spreadsheet and some side-by-side comparisons, just to help look at what this real impact is, that when this thing does, when the fuse gets lit, what's really going to happen. And I can't reiterate enough the concern I have for how are we even going to handle all this if we have to process even just 900 permits going through P&D in 1 year. I don't see it's feasible that we're going to be able to really do that. And so that's pushing me to look at a phased approach so we can keep a handle on it. And then one more thing was, and I think I heard Commissioner Cooney talk about this before, is we're going to want to make sure somehow that this continues to come back to the Planning Commission and that it's an evolutionary process. And I'd like to know if that's not possible or if it is. You know, am I dreaming? So is that a false sense of security I'm putting on, is that, well, we're going to continue to have oversight and guide this business as it evolves. Thank you.
Commissioner Blau, if I may, just one follow-on.
Please do.
I've been asked about the permit process more specifically than the information that we have been given, and I'm wondering if we couldn't have in your presentation some information, sort of the steps, how it's going to work, so that the public has an understanding of when somebody applies, what that means, what the staff does, and so on and so forth, at their next hearing as well. Thank you.
And I'll make comment on that as well. And I think I answered 2 phone calls yesterday, and one of them was pretty lengthy about what I think the process is going to be, but it drove home that we don't know what the process is exactly yet. And I think it's necessary for us to give staff a little bit of a guidance on what we think the process should look like. It looks to me like, well, we have this attitude of trying to be customer friendly in the county and not bring things before the commission that aren't necessary. Obviously, if the zoning administrator can handle it or some staff level can handle it, that's preferable to the major CUP, which, as you heard from earlier speakers, is typically in the hundreds of thousands of dollars range and not in the $1,000 range. However, having said that, the problem is that this is so new to us now that we're hesitant to let this go to a staff level. But I think what has to happen is, as we approve several of these, we'll end up with very standard conditions. And once we've approved 50 or 100 of these projects, and we have established conditions for those projects, the staff will have adequate guidance that maybe at that point in time we can turn it over to a zoning administrator where it doesn't come before us and inundates this commission with, you know, the same issues every week. It's kind of like I kid Commissioner Brown about the zoning, about the lighting ordinance. Makes me so angry that we don't have a lighting ordinance in this county, so that every time we have a project, Commissioner Brown spends a half an hour dealing with the night sky issues. I get it, but it would be better if we just simply had the ordinance that way, just applied standardly, and she doesn't have to worry about it. So I see that as being a goal, and hopefully we could have a little discussion of that at our next hearing, so it's real clear as to you know, what we think the process should look like now and where we hope to have it in 6 months or a year from now. I agree with the earlier speaker that talked about the 20,000 square foot building and that facility. It needs to mirror other operations in the county. I'm not sure we can do that for today because we haven't had the standard regulations issued and conditions of approval, but I think it's important that we try and get there. I'll also make comment that I kind of like the idea that we incorporate some kind of a condition where the county has the ability to do an inspection to ensure compliance without notice. And I think if we incorporate that into the conditions of approval and the applicant agrees to it, then I think we've got a safe harbor there where we can actually do that. So I would appreciate when you come back, you look at that issue and see if county counsel's office would agree that we can craft some condition that would allow us to inspect it. I kind of feel the same way about the fines and misdemeanor, although that's kind of out of our purview, but perhaps the staff could take that up with the board at their next hearing, so maybe there could be something that would come back to us and would have some guidelines from them that where we could do the fines and the inspection. I also tend to the issue of the noticing. I totally agree. We constantly are improving our notice provisions. We spent considerable time this last year changing it, doing signage, doing different things. I would agree that it would be appropriate to have 1,000-foot noticing, not the typical 300, 500, or whatever it has now. In fact, I'm not so sure that's not a good idea for almost all things we notice, to tell you the truth. I see so many problems in the last 11 years where people come up and didn't get notice, and it adversely affected them. If they had it, we might have had a different condition or a different view of the project. So I think that's appropriate. The last thing for me is the issue, and I'm just going to say it now. I am almost thoroughly convinced I'm not going to recommend anything to go to the board where any of the cannabis is grown outdoors, not in a sequestered, odor-controlled environment, period. I mean, I've been doing a little research of late. I understand that there are technologies available. Carbon filtration is one system. Another one is air misting it, where it actually removes the odor, not masks it, removes the odor from the enclosure, and it doesn't migrate past the property lines. And I'm just not understanding why. Well, I'm also learning there's other communities, some in Colorado, for example, that have that kind of rule. They have no odor migration outside of the property lines, period. And they've got, and I've even determined that there are sophisticated little guns. It's called a nasal something or other. Not cheap, $2,000 technology, but this will stay on the property line and you can measure it. And if there's odor migrating from the property, it'll tell you. And there are technologies, like I say, that remove the odor entirely. So that's the one thing. And I can't see where we do, 10 acres or 20 acres. I don't care. Odor is odor. If you create the odor and it migrates to your neighbor's property, no, I'm not going to be inclined to approve that CUP. Those are my comments. I don't have any others from the other commissioners. Any comments from staff? That being said, I think we'll take a 10-minute break and set up for Dr. Russell. And I would like to invite Mr. Parks to come join us. Mr. Russell is going to just do we're teaching us some things. We're not doing anything that's going to be voted on. So if you would like to hear, am I correct? Oh, it's going to be voted on? I'm sorry that I have to, sorry. I thought it was just informational. Last one was informational. This one we're taking an action. I got it.
Chair Blau, if I can interrupt for a second. I think for the record, I think it'd be good to make a motion to actually continue this matter to the 24th, the special hearing that we set up earlier.
So moved. Make a motion to continue this meeting or this item to the 28th, right?
24th. 24th.
I'll second that.
Mr. Villalobos, call the roll, please.
Commissioner Brown.
Aye.
Commissioner Farini. Chair Blau.
Aye.
Motion passes 3-0.
Okay, thank you. We're ready to go back on the record. Mr. Villalobos, if you'll read the next item in the record, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The following is a hearing on the request of the Santa Barbara County Planning and Development Department to consider case number 17 ORD 17 and recommend that the Board of Supervisors find that the adoption of the revised thresholds is exempt pursuant to CEQA Guideline Section 15064.7, 15378, and 15378D.
Great. Dr. Russell, good morning again.
Yes, good morning, Commissioners. I have made this presentation to you before, but I'd like to go through it again because it's probably maybe even a little bit clearer than the first time. Plus, it will give me the opportunity to talk about some important things that have transpired since the last time we met on the 20th. So this is the guidelines for determining significance of impacts to cultural resources, archaeological, historic, and tribal cultural resources. The purpose of this effort, which was a lot more work than I had anticipated, was to revise Chapter 8 of the Environmental Thresholds and Guidelines Manual. Currently, that chapter is entitled Cultural Resources Guidelines, Archaeological, Historic, and Ethnic Elements. The proposed title is a little different, covers the same basic material, Guidelines for Determining the Significance and Impacts to Cultural Resources, Archaeological, Historic, and Tribal Cultural Resources. This is the manual. This is what staff uses when they review projects pursuant to the California Environmental Quality Act. And there are a whole number of chapters that pertain to different resource areas. And here is, in fact, the table of contents. And Chapter 8 is the current title of the guidelines. CEQA functions with thresholds of significance, which are defined as an identifiable, quantitative, qualitative, or performance level of a particular environmental effect, non-compliance with, which means the effect will normally be determined to be significant by the agency, and compliance with, which normally will be determined to be less than significant. CEQA encourages the local agencies to adopt and publish thresholds of significance that are crafted to the local circumstances. It provides lead agencies with broad discretion with regard to adopting thresholds. And of course, thresholds, as all of our decisions, must be based on substantial evidence. These are the thresholds, really. The initial study checklist has a series of questions, and the answers to those questions determine whether or not you've gone over the threshold. All of the work that I have done is provide staff with the tools to be able to answer these questions. There's a process to revise the thresholds. The Environmental Thresholds and Guidelines Manual needs to be periodically amended if there is new information or changed environmental circumstances. In this case, it's new information. CEQA has changed so significantly since the early 1990s when the current thresholds were adopted that there is all sorts of good stuff to rely on that's in there. And that's really what I've done, is incorporated that with some direction as to how to understand and interpret all of this material from the CEQA statute and guidelines. And then the Planning Commission needs to hold 2 public hearings in the north and south. And this is for the purpose of refining and revising existing thresholds as opposed to adopting brand new thresholds, which was the last thing that took place when we did the GHG thresholds. Basically, these thresholds guidance documents that I have created have basically 3 parts. The first part talks about how it is that you identify those characteristics that qualify the resource as a significant cultural resource. The second is how do you evaluate the severity of potential impacts to significant cultural resources. And then third, there's a brief discussion of mitigation that may avoid or lessen a potentially substantial adverse change to a significant resource. Now, categories of cultural resources. This is perhaps the most confusing part of CEQA. They refer to everything as historical resources. And so historical resources, you immediately think, oh, like an old building, a historic building. But actually, historical, as opposed to historic, resources include archaeological resources, tribal cultural resources, and historic resources, what you would most typically think of when you hear the word historical. So the guts of the guidelines really focus on this section 15064.5A of the guidelines. And if you are a historical resource, that means you're a significant cultural resource. And what it basically says is there's different ways to be determined to be a historical resource. You can be listed or determined eligible at the state level. You can be listed in a local register of historical resources. I'll gloss through these. Or you can meet one of 4 criteria, and here they are: is associated with events that have made a significant contribution to the broad patterns of California's histories and cultural change. These are similar to the National Register, but a little bit different. Is associated with the lives of persons important in our past, embodies the distinctive characteristics of a type, period, region, etc., or has yielded or may be likely to yield information important in prehistory or history. And then this final part of that section of the guidelines makes it clear that lead agencies have the authority to make these determinations, that we don't have to rely on the state to make them. So basically, most of what we do is look at those 4 criteria and then see whether a resource meets one or more of those criteria. There is additional guidance in CEQA. That's the main chunk right there, is historical resources. But there's additional guidance that pertains to the various sort of subcategories, if you will, of historical resources. Those are in the guidelines, but I won't belabor them today. But there are sections on archaeological sites, unique and non-unique archaeological sites, historic resources, including discussion of a local register of historical resources, Historic Landmarks Advisory Commission. We have Santa Barbara County landmarks and places of historic merit. There are requirements for historical resource surveys. So you may, if you are part of a survey, a historical survey, have been identified, a resource has been identified in a historical survey that meets a certain quality, that would qualify you as a historical resource. And also historic districts and landscapes. There's information on those that would qualify those as historical resources. Now, the significance determination and impact assessment process for archaeological and historic sites, it's basically phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. Phase 1 is an inventory. It's different for historic versus archaeological resources, the nature of the information in the inventory, but they're similar in the sense that you're just looking to see what's there. Phase 2, you look at significance. Is it significant? Many things end with phase 1 determination. There's nothing there. If there's something there, you go to significance evaluation and impact assessment. It's a little bit different for archaeological versus historic resources, but that's where mitigation is proposed. This is, and depending upon the outcome of phase 2, you would have that's when you would answer the various questions in the initial study. Either it's a class 1 or a class 2 or a class 3, class 2 with mitigation. And then phase 3 is usually the mitigation. It can be such things as data recovery for an archaeological site, but it can be a variety of different kinds of mitigation. Something added recently in 2015 to the CEQA statute, and I did a lot of work on this when the legislation was going through, worked with the Office of Planning and Research on a couple of panels, and I was mostly it was tribes in the room, and I was the only planner and the only archaeologist on the panel. The tribal cultural resources, basically what these are things that are important to tribes. They can be things like archaeological sites, which are already covered by CEQA, or they can be intangible things like gathering areas or cultural landscapes. One of the significant aspects of the new law is that it identifies tribes, state or federally recognized, as experts, as CEQA experts in terms of identifying what is a tribal cultural resource and what constitutes appropriate treatment of a tribal cultural resource. Earlier versions of the law basically allowed the tribes to determine what happened in a project, and that was incredibly problematic. And so what they did was they added in, and I have a slide that shows the language if you're interested in seeing it, they basically, consultation is required, and if a tribe requests consultation, we've had one request so far. The Santa Ynez Band has not made a request yet, and that's, you know, I mean, that's up to them. I'm not going to do AB 52 consultation unless it's legally required, and they haven't made a request. That's fine. I work with Freddie Romero all the time, but if they do make a request, then you have to send them all NDs, MNDs, and EIRs and consult. And so you give them the opportunity, once they've made the general request, on everything, and then they have 30 days to say whether they want to consult or not. And there's no real definition of what constitutes consultation. It has to be meaningful. It has to be confidential unless the tribe says you can release this information. But it ends when agreement is reached or when there is no agreement. So there is a clear provision that says if agreement can't be reached, that's the end of consultation. The potentially problematic from an applicant's point of view, I would think, about this is that all the consultation that I've ever done with, I've been very open to consulting with tribes both in Santa Barbara County and San Diego County, and it's always been good faith. But I guess there is the possibility that given the fact that folks are recognized as experts, I think that if the tribe stands up and says, hey, you've got an MND and I don't think the mitigation is accurate, you're probably headed for an EIR. But again, my experience has been that the consultation that I've been involved with all tribes and individuals has been good faith. So now going on to determining the second aspect, which is if you've got a significant resource, what do you do about evaluating adverse impacts? These are just some examples: non-scientific collecting, destruction through project development, indirect impacts. You put in a housing development next to an archaeological site, which is not directly impacted, but people are over there collecting artifacts and things, vandalism, etc. And there's a definition of a substantial adverse change, which is very helpful. Most resource areas are not treated with this level of detail in CEQA. And so my attitude is, I mean, biology doesn't have nearly this detail in CEQA in terms of what you do and how you evaluate impacts. And so I find this to be very useful because we can just say, look, state law, this is what we need to do. It's very convenient, and it's appropriate too. Mitigation and design considerations, they vary for archaeological sites. You can avoid them. You can put a protective cap on them. You can curate the collections from the excavations. You can put temporary fencing around them during construction activities. Tribal cultural resources are different. You can avoid them, but you can protect traditional use of a gathering area. There is in the law the provision that tribes may be given permanent conservation easements as a form of mitigation. And in the historic built environment, preservation in place, landmarking, documentation, and the use of the Secretary of Interior standards, and that's codified in CEQA as well, that says if a structure is restored or rehabilitated pursuant to those standards, it's good. There's also a number of other things which, although are not absolutely threshold related, they are in the guidelines because we can use them. In the CEQA statute and guidelines, there are sections that pertain to what you do if you know as you move into a project that there are Native American burials there. What do you do if they're accidentally discovered, which happens all the time? And what do you do if you find non-human archaeological remains? And we use these sections to put conditions on our project that, hey, if you hit something during construction, this is what you got to do. Now, what I did was I did the guidelines document, and then I sent it out to a broad set of stakeholders. And what I heard back from a number of them was, hey, you're not going to be here forever, and Joyce Gerber's not going to be here forever. And we need the rules. We don't just need guidelines. We need some rules about what constitutes adequate field work and adequate reporting. And so that added quite a bit of work to my plate. And so, and that's the document which you have been given a revised version of. And it replaces a set of regulations that were never formally adopted by the board. And the purpose is to make it clear what information you need to have in your reports and what constitutes adequate field work. I've talked to archaeologists, I've talked to Native Americans, and I've talked to historians, and they're all pretty good with what I've got in place right here. So I think we're there. Even the day before yesterday, I met with the Historic Landmarks Advisory Commission, and they made a couple of very useful comments that I hadn't thought of. They suggested add an example of a negative historic resources letter report. We have a template in the back, but they said you ought to have an example. That's fine. And they said clarify when a letter support, report should be required as opposed to a full phase 1-2 report. And what they were talking about was that, you know, when staff has an old house or an old building, they're not really going to know whether it's a significant historic resource or not. And so it's fairly easy and inexpensive to the applicant to go to a historical architect or a historian and have them do a quick 1-2 page report. And a lot of those are negative and you're done. And then staff has the evidence that they need to be able to say there's no issue. Or if there is an issue, that report can be expanded. And that's very different than an archaeological report where you've either got an archaeological site and you have to do something with it or not. I mean, I've added just a brief reference to that, so I think it's very useful. The HLAC has been working on a GIS layer that includes all of the known historic resources that the county knows about, like buildings and so forth. And they've been working on this for a few years. I wasn't really aware that that exists, so they said, hey, make sure that there's a reference to that in your report guidelines. So I added a reference to that. And also they said there are certain kinds of permits, not limited to demolition permits, but when we do land use permits or CDPs, we don't normally do CEQA review on those. Those are, and so, however, if a land use permit for, say, the demolition of a historic building, it turns out that it's a significant resource, you trigger the exception to the exemption, and that is no longer exempt from sequence. They said, you need to really put that in there. I said, you're right, I do. And then I'm going to meet one more time with some local historians. They just wanted to see the changes that I made pursuant to their recommendations. But I think we're pretty good. And so these are my recommendations that I would love for you to make so that I can go to the board on February 27th for adoption. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Commissioner Brown.
Thank you. Dr. Russell, thank you for all the effort you've put into this. This is very important for our community and for many of the residents who live here. So I'm glad to see the work that you've done here. I have a question on cultural landscapes. Can you just sort of broadly define what that might look like, what that might be for
so
what it is?
I will use a local example.
Please.
There's the street out in front of the county building is Anapamu. Well, that is named after a hill called Napamu, which is on on private land, and so there are no artifacts there. There's no features that are cultural in terms of being constructed, but it is a sacred site to the Santa Ynez Band. And we were going to, well, it was in front of you, I think. I think it came in front of you a few years ago, where we were going to put in an ag reservoir. And I'm not sure if it came to you or not. Maybe it was a minor conditional use permit. And so the tribe came forward. We did all the archaeology, didn't find anything. We're completely unaware of this thing. And the tribe came forward and said, hey, wait a minute, not so fast. That hill is sacred to us. And so that's an example of a sacred landscape. There also is a National Register bulletin that is referenced somewhere in the documentation that I've created, that basically it is the reference for cultural landscapes. And so that would, if you want to know more, I think I provided a hot link to it, and you can read how the most cultural landscapes have been dealt with in the context of the National Register of Historic Places, although we are now starting to see them dealt with in CEQA, and with the approval of AB 52, there is now an explicit reference in CEQA to cultural landscapes.
So what I'm hearing you say is that for this county, there would be some information that we could go look up to find where these cultural landscapes would be and their importance to the tribes? Or not necessarily?
The information exists, but it is dispersed.
Oh,
so
okay.
there is not a single definitive guide to the cultural landscapes of Santa Barbara. There is a sacred lands database that the Native American Heritage Commission maintains. And basically that's confidential, and what you do is you, when a project comes in, you send them a letter and say, is there anything listed?
I see.
And they will, and they'll either say, no, we have nothing, which doesn't mean that there is nothing, or they'll say, yeah, there's something there, you need to go talk to the tribe.
Okay, that's helpful. Okay. That's helpful, and that's very important to know this. Thank you.
Any others? Okay. I'm going to just for fun ask for public hearing. Public comment, I'm sorry. No public comment. Then I'll close the public hearing, come back to the commission for recommendation.
I would be most happy to follow staff's recommendations with much appreciation to Dr. Russell for his efforts.
And I'll second.
Great. Having a first and second, we have comments from county council. Yes.
Mr. Chair and Commissioners, just to clarify that this motion includes the revised cultural guidelines, because I think they've been changed since the staff report.
That's correct. And those were the minor revisions that I had on the previous slide that were based on input from HLAC.
So
It does include
we're
that.
adopting
Thank you.
as the most recent staff recommendations.
Yes. Thank you.
Great. Mr. Villalobos, if you read the roll call.
Commissioner Brown. Aye. Commissioner Farini.
Aye.
Chair Blau.
Aye.
Motion passes 3-0.
Great.
Thank you very much.
So do we have additional business today? We done? Then we're adjourned. Thank you.